Oh boy, the Resident Evil 3 remake. I've been wanting to do something to officially kickstart this channel, since carryover videos and the older content on here doesn't exactly spark joy. And given the perception that I've seen from a lot of other YouTubers on the Resi 3 remake, it apparently doesn't spark joy with a lot of other people either. So, do I think it's a good game? Bad game? Do I think it remade the original well? I guess we'll have to get into that, because Resident Evil 3 to me is the very definition of a mixed bag. What's up guys, this is Cirrus, and welcome to my channel. Given the low subscriber count, I'll assume you're new. If that's the case, hi, how's it going? Why not hang your Mr. X-sized trench coat on the subscribe button and stay a while? And let's sit down and have a chat. A chat about a game that released earlier this month that I have some very mixed emotions towards. Let's start out with a little backstory for what this game meant to me, and then we'll get into the things that it changed, the bad, the good, and then my conclusions. I want you to imagine a world where the internet isn't as prominent as it is now, where YouTube doesn't have every single video known to man within its repertoire. You're a kid who has just been introduced to the Resident Evil series through your friend on his GameCube. Your first experiences with the franchise are with the Resident Evil 1 remake with its hyper-realistic visuals for the time. This game is terrifying to you as a kid, but it's also really intriguing. To me, Resident Evil was one of the first adult games I ever got a chance to play. And not adult in the tongue-in-cheek, haha, this is meant for adults, but we're totally piloting it towards kids way. I grew up with Conker's Bad Fur Day as well, after all. No, Resident Evil was the first game that I actually got to play that was very mature about its source matter and also not aimed at me, a kid. My friend wanted to do a little experiment with me, handed me his GameCube controller and said, go ahead and try to walk around. And this is when I got my first experience with tank controls. I was a kid who grew up with the silky smooth controls of Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. These clunky excuses for movement were not something I was prepared for. It didn't help that unlike games like Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie, Resident Evil didn't equip you at all for what lied ahead. I met my first zombie, promptly died, and swore myself off of the game for years. And by years, I of course mean I asked my mom to get me Resident Evil Code Veronica because I wanted to play a Resident Evil game and this one looked at least a little more cartoony and easier for me to manage, which turned out to be accurate. After playing Code Veronica, I went to play Resident Evil 0. This was another game that my friend had owned, and honestly, it didn't do atmosphere anywhere near as well as the original remake. This had the pleasant side effect of making it much easier for me, as a scared kid, to manage. I then went on to play Resident Evil 2, which I had previously seen my friend play on his N64 when the GameCube version of that came out. I absolutely fell in love with RE2. So when Resident Evil 4 was announced and I knew that Leon was going to be on the front cover, I was very excited. But I skipped a game, you say, and that's true. You see, there are two major installments in this series I hadn't played yet. The original edition of 1, of course, and then 3. The only thing I knew about 3 is that you got to play as Jill again, and there was apparently a tyrant named Nemesis in it. This game always intrigued me. It sat on the back burner as something that I'd love to play one day, but my local game store never had a copy of it. Hell, when the Resident Evil 2 remake came out, I got the last copy my local game shop had. Speaking of game shops, there was a shop I used to frequent a lot called Homefield, and that shop used to have lock-ins. This is where all the local kids in the neighborhood would sit inside the game shop from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., giving all of our parents a wonderful night of sleep while we got hopped up on soda and pizza. There were card and video game tournaments the entire time, and the ability to play whatever game system you wanted. During this time, a friend of mine, Shane, brought his copy of Resident Evil 3 he had just purchased. I was there at the time with my friend Tony, and both of us were incredibly excited to give this game a try. Like I said, we knew sprinklings of what Resident Evil 3 was, and I had seen scattered cutscenes from this game thanks to various fan websites using them for music videos. Maybe a little cringy nowadays, but when you haven't had a chance to play a game, sometimes you consume all the media related to it that you can. Shane fired up his copy of Resident Evil 3 and was instantly turned off by the tank controls. He had started on Resident Evil 4, and 3 was a bit of a culture shock to him. Tony and I, on the other hand, didn't have such issues. We had played the originals. This was something we understood. We agreed that Tony would play through 3 while I did another playthrough of 4 on an adjacent TV, and now I have all but the fuzziest recollections of Tony doing the puzzles in the park while trying to dodge hunters and zombies in Raccoon City. Fast forward a couple years, I still couldn't find find a copy of 3 at any local game shop. Maybe I was just really unlucky, but eventually I stumbled across a copy of the game for the PC. Now the PC port of Resident Evil 3, it's a bit botched, but it was my first experience playing through the game from front to back. But unlike RE0, 1, 2, and even Code Veronica, I never went back and revisited this game. Sure, I had some really fond memories of it, but I never properly went through and reevaluated my opinion on that game. Suffice to say, this left me with a lot of nostalgia. Fast forward to last year, the Resident Evil 2 remake comes out, and it is an absolute bombshell. It ends up streamlining a lot of things that the original 2 did poorly, but it also ended up cutting some things out that made the original shine. For instance, the alligator boss fight got turned into a simple series of QuickTime events. Its boss fights were a mixed bag of serviceable and just plain old clunky. Everything else in the game was absolutely superb though, from the graphics to the sometimes awkward adaptive lighting engine to the new star of the show, Mr. X, a character who a lot of people didn't even remember being in the original and thought was a new addition to the game. I was a Resident Evil fanatic growing up, so I knew about Mr. X from the B scenarios of Resident Evil 2, and I also own the novel of Resident Evil 2 still to this day. Mr. X features pretty prominently in the novel, but he's almost an afterthought in the game, something that's just thrown into the B scenario to spice things up a smidge. This is not the treatment he was given in the Resi 2 remake. He was turned into a stalker that would constantly trounce around the RPD, and you never quite knew if he was right outside the door, or if he was legitimately walking around a floor above you and you were pretty safe. And God forbid you tried to fire your weapon once while defending yourself. He would hear it and rush at you from wherever he happened to be in the Raccoon City Police Department. This turned the Mr. X from the original, from scripted spice added in to make the scenario be a little more palatable, to a fundamental game mechanic that changed the way you navigated the Raccoon City Police Department. He also seemed to emulate something that many fans had grown accustomed to in Resident Evil 3, the way the Nemesis would stalk you. Now, for those who don't know, the original Resident Evil games had every area locked behind a different loading zone. This meant a game tracking where a zombie was, outside of the area you were currently occupying, was basically impossible. The original PlayStation didn't exactly have the power to do that without rendering those other areas as well. This meant that Nemesis's encounters with you were more or less scripted or random, depending on which stage of the game you were at. Seeing Mr. X act in a way that we wished the technology was available to make Nemesis act in the original version of Resident Evil 3, this was an absolute treat, and it meant that if we were to get a Resident Evil 3 remake, I couldn't wait to see what they would do with Nemesis. In the original 3, he was already a stronger, faster Mr. X that was able to wield weaponry. In the remake, he should be all of that and constantly be stalking you through the streets of Raccoon City, making even the most benign tasks of walking from one store to another a terrifying exercise in anxiety management. This ultimately brings us to what were our expectations for the Resident Evil 3 remake? What did I personally want to see out of it, and what did it seem many of the fans wanted to see out of a remake of the original? Alrighty, expectations. I already went over how I wanted the Nemesis to function, and I think most fans would echo my sentiments, where we wanted Nemesis to be a souped-up, more powerful, more intimidating Mr. X. There was also a system inherent to Resident Evil 3 that let you choose between different paths at certain points in the game. Depending on the path you took, you would have to do things like fight Nemesis more often, encounter certain characters earlier than expected or in entirely different locations, or sometimes the entire circumstances behind a character's death would be altered. Like this scene here where Tyrell is alone but dies due to an explosion, but if I encounter it from a different area, now he's confronting Nikolai and we get to see more of how Nikolai acts towards his compatriots. Ultimately, the branching paths didn't do anything to change the fundamental story, but they did give you something to replay for. You could do a playthrough and approach the game completely differently, at least to an extent. The technology wasn't there to do a lot with this, but the game also randomized all of its ammo, so 2 playthroughs would end up having different enemies, different ammo, and sometimes different cutscenes depending on the way you went around the game. This meant that replaying 3 was a bit more of a treat than in other games. Well, kind of, but I'll get into that later. A lot of fans expected this diverging system to be in the game, and this also meant they expected the game to have more than one ending. The original had 3, for instance. Resident Evil 3 also kept itself mostly to back alleys behind stores and shops. We didn't get a whole lot of time to explore Raccoon City in any open and proper sense. This means that a lot of people expected a more open environment so that we could really immerse ourselves in the lives of the people who lived in Raccoon City before it went the explodey way. Also, with Nemesis being a more souped-up Mr. X, I personally definitely expected there to be a laundry list of rewards for actually trying to tangle with him, since in the original, you could get everything from handgun upgrades to full-on new weapons just from choosing to fight instead of run away from Nemesis, letting players decide to sacrifice some health and ammo in order to gain an advantage later in the game by getting various upgrades by fighting their fears instead of running from them. Basically, we expected a souped-up better version of 3 that did everything it did well and enhanced certain aspects of the original in ways that we couldn't really do back in the day, giving us a better Nemesis, giving us more impactful choices throughout the story. But what did we actually get? Well... let's start with the first major change. Nemesis is even more scripted in this version of the game than he was in the original. While this makes for some absolutely breathtaking scenes and heart-pounding action, it's only heart-pounding the first time through. Once you realize that Nemesis will appear at these scripted locations, the tension in the atmosphere that's normally present when he's around completely vanishes. Unlike Mr. X, who evolves with you as you learn his patterns and learn how to abuse his AI, who transforms from an unmanageable aspect of horror that you have to try to dodge around the Raccoon City Police Department into another piece in the ever-moving cog of Resident Evil 2 that you have to put together in order to min-max the game on second run-throughs. Nemesis in this version feels very stripped down. I mean, sure, encounters with him will yield loot, but it's less loot than was in the original. In the original, we got parts to assemble a handgun, a whole new weapons, even a box to hold multiple first aid sprays only using a single item slot. In this version, we only get a couple of handgun parts and some shotgun shells and grenade rounds, meaning that there's only really any excitement to your first couple encounters with Nemesis if you're looking at confronting him for the loot. Also, in the normal difficulties of the game, these confrontations are boiled down to just tossing a grenade under his skirt and letting it go off. This does enough damage to the Nemesis for him to drop his loot and stay stunned long enough for you to walk away at a snail's pace. While the Resident Evil 2 remake enhanced the original Mr. X and turned him into a bigger, better version of himself, the Resident Evil 3 remake strips Nemesis of most of his identity and everything but cutscene alone. Sure, the first time you try to manage him, he seems like a bigger, stronger, more imposing Mr. X, but once you realize how heavily scripted he is, he becomes a joke and a cakewalk. This is not a good thing for a character who's supposed to be the titular problem we deal with in a survival horror game. Also, the branching path system, that was completely axed. We get no extra endings, and speaking of content being cut out of the game, the original Resident Evil 3 had a Mercenaries Mode to complete at the end that allowed you to get new weapons you could use in the story of the game, and this mode has been completely stripped out of the remake. It's not all for loss, though. The idea behind the upgrades you could buy with the in-game currency is still in here. It's just tied to beating certain events in the main story now. Those are new the currency, and it could be anything from completing the game on certain difficulties, to seeing a certain cutscene, to shooting a couple hundred hats off of random zombies. I like the system. I'm glad it's in here, but I would have actually been pretty happy with Mercenaries Mode staying in. At least we got Resident Evil Resistance as well, I guess? The game also has a slew of weapon mods that you can use to customize your weapon, so that's not a bad thing. And the game has changed the dodge mechanic from the original into something that's at least more manageable. There's also a few minor details like being able to turn your flashlight on and off. The original didn't have a flashlight, so that's at least neat. And there's also these little Charlie dolls everywhere, like the Mr. Raccoons that were added to the Resident Evil 2 remake. This game also has more difficulty modes, so they definitely want you to be replaying through with those upgrades. That said, a lot of puzzles have been cut from the original. Whole areas from the original were actually removed. You don't really spend any time in Raccoon City Park, and the clock tower is completely missing. Instead, we get an asset swap sewer system, which in the original was a single pathway that sometimes had spiders. In this one, it's an entire intricate area that is ugly, drab, and we really didn't want to be in. Also, the Gravedigger Boss has been completely cut, which, considering he was a really unique boss in the original in that you could actually fight him using no ammo with just an environmental kill, so long as you were skilled enough to dodge him repeatedly. You also don't get to go to the Raccoon City Police Department as Jill in this one, you get to go through as Carlos. Freezing rounds were removed from the grenade launcher's repertoire of ammo, and the gunpowder crafting system works like the one we got in the Resident Evil 2 remake and not like the one in the original version of 3. In the original version of 3, you had to use a reloading tool with your gunpowder, but depending on the gunpowder that you used, there was actually a hidden level up mechanic. This meant that the more you crafted a single type of ammunition, the better you got at crafting that type of ammunition, to the point where you were able to actually make enhanced versions of that ammo. This was a nice little upgrade and reward for sticking to your guns, as it were. This was, of course, completely axed from the remake, and I don't really understand why. But now that we've got a little convenient list of changes out of the way, that leaves us with the bad, the good, and my conclusions. So let's rip the band-aid off and get into the actual bad things in this game. So the first thing you'll notice is that this game is a bit of a downgrade visually from Resident Evil 2. For one, gone is the adaptive lighting engine from the Resident Evil 2 remake, leaving us with a more standard cinematic lighting engine that you would expect from other run-of-the-mill games of this era. It does make the game run a little smoother on lower-end systems, but I still really liked that engine. Nemesis in this game, who should have been an incredibly prominent figure, is prominent in story alone and not so much in game mechanic. In the Resident Evil 2 remake, Mr. X became a layered game mechanic that you had to constantly be adjusting for during a playthrough. Nemesis doesn't act that way. He's a scripted boss that's meant to be there to scare you every once in a while, and while these cutscenes are breathtaking and awesome and heart-pounding the first time around, they honestly start to feel really run-of-the-mill and tacked on the more times you play through. Also, you'll notice that the character models in this game do a lot of really strange things. Maybe it's just my graphics card, but Jill's eyebrows seem to disappear into her head depending on the lighting, and the zombies themselves are all asset swaps from Resident Evil 2's remake. In fact, most of this game's environments are asset swaps from Resident Evil 2's remake. Most of the architecture in here can be easily identified from the RE2Make, and after a while that makes it feel like this game doesn't have much of its own identity. I know that development of this game was happening alongside RE2, and that's why we were able to get it out so fast right after the RE2 remake, but honestly, I feel like the fact that the clock tower was cut was due to them not wanting to design assets for it, and I feel like the reason we got a sewer system instead was because they had already designed these assets for the sewer system in the RE2Make. It really makes this game feel like a lot of its identity has been stripped away, especially considering the phenomenal execution of Mr. X being how I wished Nemesis acted in this game. I also really wish a lot of that stuff from the original had been kept in with this game, like the ability to craft different types of ammo and level up so that you could do things like a pistol-only run-through, or a shotgun-only run-through, or even a 100-round Magnum run-through, while getting enhanced rounds and even more ammunition for dedication to a particular weapon. I also liked the randomized encounters of the original. This gave new playthroughs of the game a lot of distinctive flavor. One time you're running through the park and there's just these eels coming out and that's not much of an issue. The next time around it's completely swarmed with hunters and now suddenly you've got to run for your life. I'm sure there are some people that are going to say that these aren't bad things, these are just changes from the original, but every remake of a Resident Evil game thus far has enhanced the original insofar as it can. The remake of RE1 added in the Lisa Trevor sub-story, Crimson Heads, and extra modes post-game, leading all the way up to a mode where you even had an invisible zombie constantly trying to chase you that would explode if you killed it. Just interesting stuff added to the original. The RE2 remake did much the same. I know it was via DLC, but we got the Ghost Survivors modes. The game expanded the Umbrella Laboratory at the end of the game into a much longer and much more fulfilling area. It added in windows that you can board up that can prevent zombies from entering in, but you only have a limited number of boards. This meant you had to strategically board up the windows that you knew you were going to be crossing more times than not, and I can't stop singing the praises for how they handled Mr. X. They even did things like stripping Mr. X away from the latter half of the game in Claire's campaign alone, so that that campaign can focus more on the Birkin family, while Leon's can focus more on the espionage and nightmare. These are all brilliant changes and brilliant additions, and the Resident Evil 3 remake just feels like it stripped things away instead of focusing on enhancing the original. The only enhancements we really got were visual. But speaking of that RE2 remake, you'll notice that the zombie models in this game are a bit of a downgrade from the RE2 remake zombie models. On top of that, they're a lot less threatening in this game. The RE2 zombies were bullet sponges. Zombies that in many situations it was easier to just blow off a kneecap and run, instead of fighting an endless horde on your own. RE3 gives us more zombies, but it removes the ability to knock out the kneecaps anywhere near as easily, and also lowers their health so much that it ultimately ends up being a game of just trying to kill as many zombies as possible in a run-through, instead of having to strategically choose which zombies you could afford to let live. This means that every run-through of Resident Evil 3 will end up looking largely the same. This isn't helped by the fact fact that RE3 is a much more linear game than its predecessor. This was the case with the original too, but I think that replayability not being anywhere near as present in this game is going to be a bit problematic. Speaking of things stripped away, in the hardcore version of Resident Evil 2, you got ink ribbons and essentially a classic survival horror experience. In this game, the increased difficulties just mean that zombies hit harder, are more bullet spongy, and you get less ammo. As opposed to the game mechanically changing anything different when you go to the higher difficulties, all that changes is the numbers. And I have a theory that these numbers are meant to scale up with the extra items you get when you have the ability to buy from your New Game Plus Horde. And that's cool and all, but this means that the replayability in this game feels more like playing a new character in Diablo, where I'm increasing difficulties just to give myself more numbers to deal with. And that's not inherently a bad thing, but it's disappointing for a survival horror game. The worst thing about this remake to me is that it wears Resident Evil 3's skin, but it has almost none of its character. Whereas the Resident Evil 2 remake proudly did everything the original did and enhanced it, same with the RE1 remake, almost acting as replacements for the originals, the RE3 remake feels like a wholly different game from the original, with a completely different set of ideas. The only things they have in common are the atmosphere, being mostly linear, and the main characters. And that feels like a really weird thing for a remake to do. We also spend a lot less time in Raccoon City in this version than we do in the original. This is mainly due to the fact that we've cut out the clock tower in the park, leaving room for an extended hospital visit, which I don't mind, and an extended sewer stay, which I do mind. It's also just not that scary of a game. The RE2 remake is a terrifying experience, especially helped by its adaptive lighting engine, and Resident Evil 1's remake is an incredibly atmospheric and nail-biting experience even to this day. The RE3 remake feels like a lot more action game was inserted into it than need be. But I think I've harped on this game for long enough. Now let's talk about some good, because there's actually a lot to talk about here too. Alright, the first thing that I have to talk about in this section is definitely the presentation. I know that I said losing the adaptive light engine sucked, but man, does this game have some character, and character is definitely one of the defining features that we need to talk about, both in the game itself and in what it did to flesh out its characters from the original. In the original, every character except maybe Carlos and Jill were very one-dimensional. You remembered them in name only, but they really didn't matter much in the grand scheme of things. This remake, though, takes every character and gives them multiple layers to their personality, and not just in cutscenes, also in subtext. In the beginning of the game, we get to walk around Jill's apartment in first-person mode and get an idea for what her life is like. It's here that we find that life after the Arklay Mountain incident of RE1 was not that grand, filled with a lot of alcohol, takeout, and you can even look around at the different books that she's been reading, figuring out that she actually likes mystery novels, thrillers, and she's even gotten into some science. A lot of this likely brought on from the Arklay Mountain incident. This becomes important later when we find out that we have to make our own vaccines, and Jill knows how to do it very easily.
These are combined with antigens to increase immune system response.
We get the hints that she knows what she's talking about from the very beginning of the game, and this is good. Speaking of that, the next character we get is Brad Vickers. In the original, Brad shows up for just a little bit and then gets himself killed after the bar incident by Nemesis. In this one, we get to get a phone call from him, we get to walk around the city with him, and we even get to have a really small character redemption arc for him when he saves us in the same bar that he originally got bit in the first one. This expands on his character a lot, and it makes him out to be a little less than the chicken heart we remember from the first game. This leads us into the UBCS core, and holy shit, these guys have been expanded well. In the original, Carlos was a little fleshed out, but not so much so that I would call him an endearing character. In this one, though, I think he's become my favorite character of this game. He's got some of the best one-liners.
Hey! Fuckface! But it's no zombie. It knows what it wants and won't stop till it gets it. Don't you like that in a man? I'm not gonna die on you, leave you in a cold, cruel, Carlosless world.
Okay.
And we can see from the expression on his face the times when he genuinely starts to question his allegiance to Umbrella. In the first game, he's very quick to say that he's just a hired gun as an apologetic to Jill in order to gain her favor. In this game, he begins genuinely on the side of Umbrella because he simply doesn't understand what they've been up to, and has genuine moments of care and frustration as the game goes on. We're also given a lot more scenes of camaraderie between him and Jill, which make their platonic relationship a whole lot more believable and much more enjoyable for the viewer. They start out this game game taking cheap jabs at one another, and finally get to the point in the end of the game where they'll actually be at each other's backs, risking each other's lives. This growth feels very organic. Speaking of organic, we get to see Mikhail as a lot more than just a soldier who kills himself because he feels he has to. This version of Mikhail gives orders instead of just laying down after getting bit. He has his own bits of clever banter with us in the game.
Carlos, you didn't even think to ask fine young lady her name? Her name is something Valentine. My team was sent here to rescue civilians.
Right. How's that going for you?
Most of the 100,000 civilians will wind up dead. Correction, undead.
And he even starts to slowly put together what Nikolai's plot is during the course of the story. Speaking of Nikolai, he starts to act more like an unadulterated asshole than in the original. The thing is, though, it seems like he eats up every single second he's on screen, and it makes him both endearing and absolutely detestable.
Oh, what do we have here?
Nikolai, don't! The city needs that vaccine!
More than I do. So let's make a deal. You go down there, battle the Nemesis, and I'll record it all and sell the combat data. Put on a good show, and maybe I don't need the vaccine.
Please stop re-releasing me, Capcom. I'm on everything and I just want to die.
No. You bring money. I like money. We shall make ours an ongoing arrangement.
But it really does make him a good villain. In the original, we get to see Nikolai every once in a while and kind of put together that he's not on our side, up until he gets his comeuppance when Nemesis strangles him from the ceiling. In this version of the game, we see him kill his own compatriots, we get to see through the little mannerisms on his face when he's about to do something horrible, and we get more scenes between him and Jill where we get to see his, albeit shallow, motivations play out in real time. In the original, encounters with Nikolai always felt random. In this one, encounters with him feel more predestined, and I really like that. The character that has been given the most love in this game, though, has to be Tyrell, though. In the original, he gets 2 cutscenes depending on which area of the hospital you go to first. In both, he gets a couple lines of dialogue before dying, and not much else. In this, we get to see a guy who is truly dedicated to his work, understands the reality that what he's doing is not the greatest of things, and just when it seems like we might not like him because he's a little too far into Umbrella's pocket, we get to see that he's actually a really good character, a really good person, and that he's more than willing to risk his life for his teammates and people he just wants to protect, seeing as he risks himself zipping from one end of Raccoon City to the other to get to the hospital just to be around Carlos when he needs it, and plays his part in defending you from Nemesis and watching over your body while you recover while getting a vaccine during the story. Like, this is the kind of friend that I want with me during a zombie apocalypse. The dude just has a good heart, but his heart isn't so good that he's not going to get dirty and get business done when absolutely necessary. None of these traits are things that the original managed to make me feel for this character. I didn't feel compelled to fight Nikolai in the original, but in this one I genuinely wanted to see his head blown off. I didn't care for Carlos, but in this game I honestly love every minute he's on screen. The only reason I cared about Jill in the original was because I cared about Jill from the first game. But in this one she gets so many scenes where we get to see little mannerisms and tiny details about her character that just make her infinitely more endearing. Many times she even voices exactly what the player is likely thinking at certain points, like in the beginning of the game when she begrudgingly accepts that she's going to have to help the UBCS, and near the end when she lets out her frustrations against the Nemesis.
Look, just so you know, this is the last fucking time.
All of this is good stuff. This is the stuff that makes me love this character, and none of it's the stuff we got to see in the original version of 3. These are all good. These are great improvements. Speaking of improvements, I know that I harped on the replayability of the game, but I'm actually really happy that we got multiple difficulties. Like Diablo, we get a crap ton of difficulties leading all the way up to Inferno, meaning that if the game didn't give you the challenge you wanted the first time around, it most certainly can in later stages. While I would have liked some more survival horror aspects like ink ribbons to return, this This has incentivized me to use the extra unlockable toys that I've gotten from earning in-game currency in extra playthroughs. Speaking of that, this game seriously makes you feel empowered your second time through. If on your second playthrough you get yourself a couple of hit pouches and get yourself your lockpick and your bolt cutters early, it is an absolute joy to just breeze through Raccoon City collecting all of your ammo and then taking any frustrations you might have had on your first playthrough out on the hapless citizens of Raccoon City. I mean, let's be honest, it's not the worst thing that's happened to them. Also, as far as just being a good game, this game is a phenomenal game. I emphasize that because what it doesn't do well is survival horror, and what it doesn't do well is being a good Resident Evil sequel. But as far as a good action game, this game is phenomenal in that category. Don't take all the negatives I gave earlier and say that this is just a bad game and write it off. No, this is a good game. Go play it. Let Capcom know that we want remakes of Resident Evil games. This is good. I would just prefer those remakes act more like 2 and less like 3. Also, on the design aspect, I love the new design of Nemesis. I wish we got to spend more time with him in his humanoid form, but these new designs are grotesque and breathtaking, and I am loving it. I just wish we could have got these designs with the mechanics of Mr. X. Also, the realistic intro this game gave us at the beginning, that was a good touch. I liked that. I don't want it for every game, but it definitely gave this game a little bit of identity that it had otherwise stripped away during its production. Also, dialing back to character, these little posters everywhere in the game are absolutely amazing. They breathe so much life into Raccoon City and make it feel like a real place that people once lived in. A lot of this comes down to the RE engine and its proclivity for taking real textures and mapping them onto in-game models, and using that to make an environment seem lived in and real is just great. I especially love the multiple nods to Mega Man as a crappy superhero. This old design has some history with Nintendo buffs.
We're fighting robots.
I've seen people complain about the length of this game, and I'm actually going to lump that in the good category because this game is meant to be replayed. It may have removed several of the mechanics from the original version of 3 that made replays more unique. This game feels like it's trying to do a little bit of what Resident Evil 4 did and make replays less unique but more enjoyable. Very streamlined, and honestly, I think it's a good thing given the length of the game. Also, the game's about as short as the original, so I don't know why anybody could complain about that. But I brought up Resident Evil 4 for a reason, because that is going to segue us into our conclusions. Alright, it's been a wild ride, and I know that this video has been incredibly long, but bear with me for a little bit. We've got this one section, and then we'll be done, I swear. I know I said it in the good section, but I'll say it again. This is a phenomenal game. I don't think it's a good remake. I don't think it's a good Resident Evil game on its own, but is it a good game? Yeah, this is a game that I would recommend to anybody right now. Would I recommend it as their first RE game? No, I would have to bounce between either 4, the remake of 1, or 2 before I'd recommend this as somebody's first Resident Evil experience. But this game actually does something really unique that I didn't expect. Do you remember how I talked about my experience with the original version of 3 being really blurry and me having nostalgia for it, but it being so long ago? Well, my first time through the 3 remake, I had a lot of complaints. A lot of things that I missed from the original version of 3, but then I went through and played the original version of 3 again while getting footage for this video, and I started to find that the original is actually a pretty frustrating experience for me. The branching paths being something that's cool in concept that didn't really add much to the game on the whole, and the randomized enemies being something that was neat and actually got me out of a jam once. Note this point in the park where I got killed by hunters repeatedly. One time it turned out to be dogs, and seeing as I had to do this entire area with a knife, they were much more manageable. But aside from that, this game originally was a mixed bag. This means that there was only so much they could have done with the remake when they already had a mixed bag to begin with. To me, the original version of 3 was always an okay game, but never a phenomenal one. While the original version of 1 is a great game, and the original version of 2 was a masterpiece for its time, the original version of 3 in many ways felt like a step back. And while yeah, there are aspects of the original that I wish were kept in this one, a lot of the complaints I had on my initial playthrough through were things that didn't amount to much for the original game. So upon playing the remake again, I started to notice something a little different. Without the rose-tinted glasses from the original and an actual, more modernized perspective on it, the 3 Remake became something different for me. If you look at the Remake trilogy right now, RE1Make, RE2Make, and RE3Make, and then look at the original version of Resident Evil 4, which may or may not get a remake, I don't know, I noticed something kind of magical. RE1Make is survival horror honed to a knife's edge. It's the epitome of horror the first time around and min-maxing survival the second time around. And 2 feels like that game with modernized controls. It feels like the design philosophy of the Resident Evil 1 remake, but with the technology of the modern era to improve it. Resident Evil 3 feels like the controls of 2, but in an action game that wears the skin of a survival horror game. And now let's take a look at Resident Evil 4. Well, what is 4? It's not a horror game. The only thing from that genre it does really well is suspense, but what it is a phenomenal action game with intense replayability. Awkwardly enough, with his remake trilogy, it feels like we have a smooth transition from the original version of survival horror to the more action stylings of Resident Evil 4. The Resident Evil 3 remake feels like it sits somewhere between the action of 4 and the survival horror of 2, and I think that's where it's supposed to fit. It now feels like a smooth transition from one style of Resident Evil to the other. And as a longtime fan of the series who's been following it since I was less than 10 years old, there's honestly something kind of magical about that. As someone who owns the novelizations of the series as well, I'm big into the characters. And this game gave me such wonderful representations of the characters that I grew up with and knew and loved, that honestly, this game feels like a love letter to my childhood. It's weird because I don't like the more action-heavy Resident Evils, not counting 4, but unlike some of the recent attempts like Resident Evil Revelations that found the best way to do things to be to split the survival horror into 2 different sides of the story, Resident Evil 3's remake feels like it actually marries the 2 very well, at least insofar as it's trying to be the awkward middle child between 2 and 4. It doesn't do the action as well as 4, and it doesn't do the horror anywhere near as good as the 2 remake, but in the end, we still have something that's worth more than the sum of its parts. We still get a game with nightmarish attention to detail, great character development, better updated representations of these characters, and for all the things that were stripped away from it, it really feels like a lot of heart was pumped back in. This is a game that we never needed. RE2 was more popular than 3, RE2 got a remake and it sold immensely well. Capcom could honestly keep on pumping out versions of Resident Evil 4 and sustain themselves for at least another decade, but still, we got what essentially seems like a love letter to the franchise, and this isn't the first time they've done this. We got the same kind of love letter with the Umbrella and Darkside Chronicles released on the Wii years ago. The Resident Evil 3 remake feels like a game that's catered to the fans of the series. Yeah, it stumbles in places while trying to please fans of both sides of the spectrum, the old school survival horror fans and the new school action ones, but there's definitely a certain charm to that. And while I would prefer if we get a remake of something like Code Veronica for it to act more like the remake of RE2, and while I wish that RE3 had paid more attention to what fans loved about Mr. X and given us a better Nemesis, at the end of the day, I'm actually really happy with the game we got. Remember, Umbrella Corps and RE6 exist. We know the deep, dark alleys this franchise can slide into, and we got something that didn't manage to do that and managed to impress. It doesn't have the same magic of the other remakes, but it has an awkward magic all its own. This game is the very definition of a mixed bag, but I think when you dump the contents of that mixed bag out on the table, it's a net positive. I just hope that this net positive doesn't mean we're going to get another Resident Evil 4 scenario where the game backslides into action nonsense again. I think Resident Evil is at its best when it's trying to marry survival horror and action to create a minutia of a power fantasy. It's at its best when it's a horror game the first time around and an arcade game the second time around, where your first playthrough is a desperate attempt to cling onto the meager resources the game gives you in order to just survive, and your second playthrough is an exercise in min-maxing those meager resources to come out a badass on the other side. The first time you played RE4, you didn't knock enemies down and knife them into oblivion. You wasted a lot of unnecessary ammo. Second and third times around, you can end up acting more like a machine. First time around RE2, 2, I doubt you double-tapped every zombie and got yourself hit a lot and wasted a bunch of healing items. You also probably took a lot of unnecessary damage from Mr. X. The second time through, I bet you understood that you can always run faster than Mr. X no matter how fast he goes. Meaning that if you know your way around the environment, he can never hurt you. You know that it's more likely to blow off a kneecap than a head, and thus you can save 2 or 3 shots on every zombie, and those add up. In the RE1 remake, I bet you used a lot of pistol rounds downing zombies to save your big weapons for the later enemies, but on subsequent playthroughs, I bet you realized that it was better to use your shotgun close up so that you used less ammo overall and didn't have to use fuel canteen rounds. And with the RE3 remake, I bet the first time you encountered Nemesis or multiple zombies, you tried to dodge, duck, and weave, but the second times around, I bet you used your grenades and other items in order to stun and clear paths for yourself, meaning that subsequent playthroughs looked a lot more mechanical and a lot less sporadic. This is the mark of a good Resident Evil game, when the game is terrifying the first time through, and mechanical execution for arcade high scores the second and third times. And does the Resident Evil 3 remake do that well? Yes. It's not the enhanced version of the original that I wanted in a remake. It's not a great Resident Evil game on its own, but given what it's trying to be, a good spot to be sandwiched between 2 and 4, and given what it does, I'd say this game has earned its place on my shelf. It's good. If you've been on the fence about buying it, go ahead and pick it up. It won't sate that survival horror appetite you've been trying to chomp on since the RE2 remake, and it may leave you a little empty the first time you beat it. But trust me, by the time you fire up that second playthrough, things will start to click into place. I'm not going to give this game anything like a score. I think that's honestly been done to death by other official outlets. I'm just going to say this game is definitely worth your time. And hopefully by the end of this, you felt that my video was worth your time as well. If you did, why not consider hitting the like button and subscribing? I've got a Patreon down below. If you've got a friend who's a Resident Evil fan who's been on the fence or just wants another video on the topic, why not send my video their way? I know that I'd really appreciate it. And hopefully you'll join me for my next video. And if you do, grab a snack, grab a controller, turn the lights down low, and let's have a blast.